Hey, what's up, guys? It's Bakes here, and thank you for joining me for this episode of Ranked. Again, we are going back in time and looking back at a year from the past. We are currently up to 2019, so in today's video, I'll be ranking a list of my favourite albums from the year 2019. Now, as usual, before I get into the actual list itself, looking back at the year overall and my thoughts of it as a complete, possibly a little bit of a slept-on year for myself, possibly just due to the fact that there weren't actually many albums that year that I gravitated to. Like today's video is made up of a list of 11 albums, which is a smaller amount compared to other years around this time, and especially coming off the back of the year 2018, which was a crazy year in music, at least for me personally. But looking at today's list, even the ones that are lower on the list today aren't actually that bad, and there's actually some decent stuff on the lower portion, but it's kind of stuff that I also don't often revisit, to be fair, as well. It's not till roughly the top 4 or maybe 5 that I do think the albums are starting to get, a lot stronger, and ones that I would consider to be favourites and ones that I do come back to more often. But like I said, in comparison to past years that I've done on my channel so far, this is sort of a smaller list, so we might as well get it underway. As I said, 11 albums to go through here, so let's get into my list of my favourite albums from the year 2019. Starting off my list today at my number 11 is the album When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go by Billie Eilish. This is one of, if not the biggest, global artist on my list today, with such a big fan base and following, and there is just no way of denying this being an accomplished and successful modern alternative pop album. But with that being said, I'm not in love with Billie's music, and to go hand in hand with that, I'm not in love with this album either. Where it does separate itself for me, and especially comparing it to other pop albums, is its uniqueness. Its production is insanely good. I can't stress that enough. The production on this is fucking crazy. And you also can't deny Billie's talents as a vocalist also. And this album has plenty of catchy tracks and things to enjoy, but overall it's just not really my taste. If you guys are familiar with my channel, and if you stick around to see the albums coming up, you'll know what my taste in music really is. But overall it's also not something I come back to that often. But I will say, when I was revisiting this album, putting this list together and, refamiliarizing myself with it, it actually wasn't that hard to sit through it. I sat through it pretty easy from front to back, which is also a compliment considering it's a relatively longer album as well. But if I'm really putting it into perspective, I've owned this album for a little while now, and I swear when I was re-listening to this album, there were some songs that I had never heard at all, just did not ring a bell, so that shows how often I come back and check out this album. But like I said, I'll give it its flowers, especially the respect in terms of being a pop album that I actually enjoy, but as I said, my taste in music sort of stops it from going any higher. So starting off this list at my number 11 is the album When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go by Billie Eilish. Coming into my number 10 is actually the only album I don't own a physical copy of for today's list, but here I have the album Sin by John Florini, the vocalist of one of my favourite bands right now, Trophy Eyes, and John Florini has put together this short 8-track album where he's went with a more stripped back approach compared to the band's usual style, but it still fucking works with this solo project. Firstly, one of John's greatest strengths, whether it's him by himself or with Trophy Eyes, has always been his songwriting, and it really blossoms here with each line done with so much emotion and strong storytelling. You can always paint a picture of every line of every song with so much detail, and the emotion that he sings within these songs too. John has always had this raspy voice, which I personally do like, and I think adds a lot of flair, especially to his heavier stuff when he's in the band Trophy Eyes. But I still like it here, it gives it uniqueness and it gives it something different to your standard solo artist where they're trying to really smooth out their voice. I love the uniqueness and raspiness in his. Now, there definitely are some heavy hitters when we get into the songs. These heavy hitters are just so haunting and impossible to forget for so many reasons, but also in the same breath, there are some songs which don't stick with me and don't always hit the landing, and sort of with the stripped back nature of this album, does make some of the songs drag at points because, as I said, they've all sort of got that stripped sort of feel to it, and it does sort of get slow at a point. But as I said, it's also an album of only 8 songs, so every time one of the songs misses, it's not too long till another banger comes around. And also the fact of me not owning a physical copy of this album probably stops me from listening to it as much as I probably would if I did have a physical copy. But for now, as I said, coming in at my number 10 is the album Sin by John Florini. Coming in at my number 9 is the album Nothing Happens by the band Wallows. Honestly, this is an album where every time I listen to it, it sort of surprises me by how fun it actually is, probably to a point where it shouldn't really surprise me anymore. But it's not like this album is hit after hit or anything like that, or even a genre that I would normally gravitate to, being indie pop rock kind of thing. But when shit's good, like I said, this album is fairly fun. Most people would recognize this album for the song Are You Bored Yet, which had a good run via TikTok and, viral video sort of thing. But there's so much more with songs like Only Friend, Scrawny, and Remember When, just to name a few. And to be honest, like the opening streak of songs are actually fairly solid, though it does somewhat lose steam as it goes on slightly. Like I said, my only negatives that really stick out with this one is the fact that it's a genre that I don't gravitate to or return to that often. And I think if I was to listen to this album on repeat for a while, it would sort of burn out on me a little bit. But it's easy listening, nothing mind-blowing by any means, but also nothing offensively bad either. So coming in at my number 9 is the album Nothing Happens by the band Wallows. Coming in at my number 8 is the album Ammo by the band Bring Me the Horizon. Now, if I ranked these albums of 2019 back in 2019, this album would have been much lower on the ranking. If I'm being honest, it might not have even been in this ranking because that's how much I disliked this album back in 2019. But obviously it's grown on me somewhat. I still think it's the band's weakest album since Sempiternal, but like I said, once upon a time I had no intentions of picking it up, so it's obviously grown on me a little bit. It's a bit of a weird one because it's a hard album to completely pass over because it legit has bangers that can compete with some of the band's best songs, songs like Mantra and Medicine, just to name a few. But then on the other hand, there are songs that I really don't enjoy and the songs that I genuinely skip over every time they come on. It was a bigger step in the direction that the band has committed to going forward from this album, and they have gotten better at this sort of pop metal fusion that they've been working on. But this album was a rough start. It also kind of had this EDM touch that I wasn't a big fan of. But like I said, I can't deny there are bangers on this album that, as I said, do compete with some of the band's best songs. But then also on the other hand, there are some songs that I legitimately don't like. But coming in at my number 8 is the album Ammo by the band Bring Me the Horizon. For my number 7, I have the album Steady Glow by the band In Her Own Words. Now, for an album from the year 2019, this is actually an extremely new album to me. Even the band itself has only sort of popped on my radar over the past 6 months, maybe a little bit longer. And this was sort of the first album that I really gravitated towards and something that has really warmed to me now. Obviously, it's a hard one to rank because it's something new, or at least new to me. So there is a little bit of recency bias, but over the half year that I've been listening to this album, it also hasn't really wavered too much. Obviously, I still got to get to know the songs a little bit better. There is not one single song on this album that I know word for word yet. But it's very much up my alley, being a pop punk album first of all, but also a lot of similarities to bands that I do like. Bands like Grayscale, bands like State Champs, even a touch of Mayday Parade I find a little bit. But I am cautious to not get ahead of myself with the positioning. Like I said, I don't want to put it too much higher just because I still need to get a little bit more familiar with this album. So I'm not mad about the ranking position for it for now, but here I have the album Steady Glow by the band In Her Own Words. Coming in at my number 6 is the album Hollywood's Bleeding by Post Malone. I don't know if this is a hot take opinion or not, but for me this has got to be my favourite Post Malone album. I feel like I probably hear most people say that Beer Bongs and Bentleys are their favourite, but like I said, for me it's got to be Hollywood's Bleeding. First of all, it's so much more consistent than the rest of his other albums. The weakest songs off this album still are passable, but then I also feel like there are a lot of hits as well as hidden gems. And in a lot of ways, the hits kind of also are hidden gems. I know that sounds kind of weird, but maybe a better way to describe it is I feel like a lot of the hits off this album get overlooked by hits off his other efforts. I feel like this album really does hit its peak from the middle to end of the album, which is a little bit different because normally with albums and their peaks, it's sort of from the start to middle and it dies off, but I feel like the middle to closing is where this album really hits its pinnacle. But like I said, it's so consistent compared to the rest of his other stuff. Everything on this album is at least alright. And it's a weird one because since it's come out, I've always thought that it was Post Malone's best album. Yet when I was re-listening to this album for this ranking, it still surprised me by how solid it actually was. And it might just be me, but I swear it's also got to be the Post Malone album that I hear get brought up the least. I rarely hear anybody talk about Hollywood's Bleeding. You know, they often talk about Stoney or Beer Bongs and Bentleys being his earlier stuff. A lot of people gravitate towards his newer stuff now, which I don't really get because I feel like he's sort of gotten weaker since this album. Don't hear a lot of people talk about Hollywood's Bleeding, so maybe I'll put it on your radar to go and check it out again. But coming in at my number 6 is Hollywood's Bleeding by Post Malone.
Don't you call him baby. We're not talking lately.
At my number 5, I have the album Fine Line by Harry Styles. I feel like this is the overlooked, forgotten Harry Styles album. I know he's only done 3 to date, but still in a way I feel like this one gets forgotten about. His debut album obviously made waves, you know, being his first solo project since splitting with One Direction, and then his newest of the 3 albums being Harry's House won a Grammy. Somehow, I'm not a massive fan of that album at all. But when you look at the 3 albums that he's done to date, this has got to be his best. I mean, it's his most consistent album, packing possibly forgotten bangers like Adore You, Watermelon Sugar, Lights Up, you can't forget Golden, that's a really good track as well. And like I said, I feel like they get overlooked by some of his newer bangers or big hits off the new album that aren't as good. Songs like Late Night Talking and shit like that. I don't mind that Sushi Restaurant song, I think that one's actually pretty good, but songs like Late Night Talking, man, not nearly as good as some of the best hits off this album. But back to Fine Line. It's got a bit of everything. It's got this groovy vibe, dance pop sort of thing going for it at times. Summer chill feels, a couple of ballads, even some pop rock stuff with songs like She. Again, naturally not a genre that I gravitate to, but it's got to be my favourite pop album of 2019, and to be honest, I actually don't mind sitting through this album from start to finish every now and then. So coming in at my number 5 is Fine Line by Harry Styles. Coming in at my number 4, I have the album 9 by Blink 182. This was the era of the band where most people I feel like were checked out by this point, especially after we already had a taste of their new sound with their new member Matt Skiba off the previous album being California. I feel like most people look past this album, and for sure it's still on the weaker half of the band's overall catalogue. And for the longest time, I sort of put this album off too. When actually I've come to terms with, yes, it's still on the weaker half when you look at the scale of what Blink 182 can do as a band, but at least it's fun and it's got some replay value. Like, if I'm being honest, some of the albums that I've brought up earlier on this list, going back to Fine Line by Harry Styles, or even going back to Hollywood's Bleeding by Post Malone, those are two albums that are probably better than this one, but the way I do my rankings are off personal favourites, not off how good of an album I actually think it is. And like I said, this one sort of has a soft spot for me. I often reference fast food / cheeseburger albums, which I guess I'll quickly explain for those who maybe have missed me use that term before. It's where an album, if you're looking for substance and something of quality, maybe it's not there. It's not bad to have something a little bit greasy and cheesy every now and then. And this one is sort of that to a T. If you're digging deep for substance, though I will say I don't think that there's nothing there. I think you might actually be surprised by some of the substance here overall. But, digging deep, it's not going to wow you. But taking it for what it is, I mean, it's no worse than California. In fact, I actually reckon it's slightly better than California. Again, if you're unaware, California was the album before this one, and again, it was the first new taste with Matt Skiba in the band. So yes, it's not a go-to Blink-182 album by any means, but it's got some fun tracks. Songs like Dark Side, Heaven, Pin the Grenade, Hung Over You. They're all songs that I like to come back to. By all means, not a bad album. Definitely on Blink's weaker half of their catalogue, but coming in at my number 4, I got to go with 9 by Blink 182. Moving on to my top 3, and coming in at my number 3 spot is the album Yours to Keep by the band Sticky Fingers. When I picked up this album back in the day, I wasn't a huge fan of the band. Even now, I'm not a huge fan of the band. I actually don't know much of their other stuff, if I'm being honest. But grabbing this album, I was kind of like, yeah, handful of songs that I think are solid. Something easy to chuck on and just chill out to or whatever. But every single time I listen to this album, I fucking love it. And honestly, you can listen to this album in any mood. It's a bit more polished and a bit more structured compared to the band's earlier stuff, which I'm just sort of guessing from what I can tell. Like I said, I don't actually listen to much of their other stuff, but honestly, I do think that's what I like about it in comparison. Overall, it's just such a vibe, and it's very high on a scale of albums that you can chuck on and just replay over and over. And I kind of underrate this album myself. Like, when I think of albums that are my favorites and, I have particular ones pop into my head, this one is kind of a sneaky sleeper hit. Like, I really do like this album, and I feel like it flies by because it's just so digestible. Every song, is just so easy to listen to, easy to, as I said, digest. It's easy to zone in or zone out on this album. Like I said, I'll keep this one short and sharp. Just a real good, underrated album from this year, or just in general to me. Here I have Yours to Keep by the band Sticky Fingers. For my number 2, I have the album Nulla Vita by Grayscale. This is an album that's always hung in strong for me. Not like it's an album I haven't listened to in a while, because this one's pretty frequent on my replay. But revisiting the album in full for this ranking, it just flew by perfectly. Each song flowing into the next perfectly, doesn't overstay its welcome while also not feeling like it's being cut short on you. Grayscale is probably still most well known for being a pop punk band rather than anything else. It's definitely at the forefront of their sound, but with this album they have fusions of pop, dance, almost disco at times, which give this album a little bit more character and flair. And even if you do feel like listening to a little bit more straight up pop punk, you've got their previous album Adornment to listen to if really needed. But like I said, you've still got the good shit here. You've got a pop punk song with Just Right, for example, but then, you got other ones like Baby Blue and Desert Queen, which give it a bit more of a dance feel, disco feel, if you want to, groove a little bit. But I'm going to keep this one short and sharp because I do bring up this album quite a bit on my channel. So coming in at my number 2 is Nella Vita by Grayscale.
So the winds from your phone and never look back. Fuck you and your friends and now you know I mean that.
And wrapping up this list, coming in at my number 1 is the album Fandom by Waterparks. I've loved this album ever since it came out. It's probably the album that made me fall in love with Waterparks as a band. This album just has so much personality and each song has so much character and appeal. And as a pop punk fan myself, at the forefront, this probably isn't the band's best overall showcase of that subgenre, but it's still got bangers. And because it is Waterpark and, they do like to dip their toes into more pop and electronic territory at times, it doesn't bother me that pop punk isn't being shoved down my throat with this album. It's just a good variety of energy and vibes, and it doesn't feel like a mess either, like a bunch of random stuff just being shoved together. And I think what helps with that is a lot of the song's subject matter seems to be related through messages of breakups and rocky relationships and bad blood and, even good times, but it all seems to translate together well to tie it in and not feel too all over the place. And like I said, a lot of the subject matter is the rockier parts of relationships, but you've got upbeat love songs here too. You've got songs about wanting more from the genre that they're in. You've even got some, like, I don't know how to describe it, like some self-hype songs that are fun to sing along and scream along to and are really catchy. But like I said, I've always loved this album from the first time it came out, and it's always been a top favourite of mine, not just from this year but in general. So coming in at my number 1, my favourite album of 2019, here I have Fandom by Waterparks. So there we go, guys, through my actual ranking of my favourite albums from the year of 2019. Now, as usual, I like to do a quick little recap before I do my outro, and thanks for watching and whatever. So coming in at my number 11 was the album When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go by Billie Eilish. My number 10 was an album that I don't own, but it's Sin by John Florini. My number 9 went to Nothing Happens by Wallows. My number 8 went to Ammo by Bring Me the Horizon. My number 7 went to Steady Glow by In Her Own Words. My number 6 was Hollywood's Bleeding by Post Malone. My number 5 went to Fine Line by Harry Styles. My number 4 was 9 by Blink-182. Lots of numbers there. My number 4 is the album 9 by Blink-182. Just so many fucking numbers. Moving to my top 3, it was Yours to Keep by Sticky Fingers. Number 2 was Nella Vita by Grayscale. And my number 1 was Fandom by Waterparks. I knew going into this list that these two were like lock in for 1 and 2, because I remember back in 2019 these albums were head to head for so fucking long. I didn't know which one was my favourite that year, so I just, obviously put both on blast and replay all through that year, but as I said, I had to give the slight edge to Fandom this time around. But thank you for joining me with this ranking again, guys. I always like doing these, going back to past years before I was on YouTube and ranking my favourite albums from then. So coming up next is 2018, because I'm working back year by year. And a heads up, guys, 2018 was a huge year for me. I had so many albums that I loved from that year. Not just quantity, but also quality. Lots of really good ones as well. So many so that normally when I do my ranking videos, I don't put a limit on how many I'm going to do, but I think I'm going to have to put a limit, because I reckon there's like over 25 albums to go through there, and I don't want to make the video too long or too much of a marathon to go through, so I guess I'll see how I'm feeling when we get to 2018 whenever I do that video. But thank you for joining me, guys. I appreciate it as always. Let me know some of your favorite albums from 2019, whether it was ones in today's video or some that didn't get brought up that you want to bring to my attention. I always love that. I haven't had that so far on my channel. If you guys bring up an album that I wasn't familiar with and it turns out to be one I love, I'm going to be so fucking grateful. I'll give you a shout out even. But thank you for joining me in today's video, guys. I appreciate it as always, and I'll see you for another video soon. Peace.